My name is Nicole Henson, and I am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I have been asked multiple times over the years if I would venture into doing a podcast or join in on podcasts or start one with someone or just to share some insights. And I haven't yet felt the desire to do that. Of course, I don't really ever have the desire to do that, but lately I feel more like it's kind of starting to make sense of like what that would look like or what direction to go with that. Or before I feel like I have all these pieces but don't know how they all come together. And more I feel like the puzzle's coming together, and that's kind of really the point and topic of what this YouTube channel or whatever I do here will be about is the puzzle coming together. And so more and more I realize in my life there's this becoming happening that is a becoming after the manner of the temple pattern. And so what I want to delve into here is living our lives after the pattern of the temple. And so obviously not to talk about things that are too sacred, but there has been a lot of talks from our leaders in recent years that we can and should be discussing the temple more often than we are. There's obvious things that are very sacred we don't talk about, but a lot that we can. And a lot of it is just right in the scriptures. And so that's mostly just what I want to do. This channel is going to be called Patterns and Sequences. So anybody who knows me knows why I like that. I feel like the Lord speaks to me in patterns and sequences. And so part of this channel will be also to talk about patterns and sequences and how to utilize that in your own life so that you can identify how the Lord speaks to you, how to hear him. It's going to be different for every person, right? If you're a musician, he might speak to you in patterns and sequences in music. If you're a scientist, he might speak to you in patterns and sequences in science, or a businessman, or whatever is the thing that you are passionate about. He will find a way to talk to you if you will listen. And so he talks to me in a lot of all these areas through patterns and sequences. And so learning how to go into an area of life and identify the patterns and sequences in this area, and then by living after his patterns, there's just a flow of creation that comes from that. And so we'll kind of talk a lot about that on this channel, and just how to apply the basic principles of the gospel to everything that we do in life. Also, this is a channel I'm going to have. I do write music as of recently and have been asked on occasion to share the reasoning behind the songs I write or the lyrics. And in fact, as I was pondering on some of those and like, okay, what was I thinking when I wrote this song? I realized this pattern, this temple pattern, has come out in these songs without me even being fully aware of it. And now I'm becoming more aware of like, yeah, there it is. So I will also share that music on here and the stuff that I'll be writing, where hopefully we will be able to embody God's patterns and the temple and symbolically put that into music. I also have kind of had this desire to extract Christ out of people, if that makes sense. But the light of Christ lives in all of us, and it's veiled within, and we let that light shine by not being ashamed of him, by speaking of him, by talking of him. And it's in all of us. We were all given that at birth, the light of Christ. And so I feel like everybody has this perfected pattern and light of God that is inside of them, that I like to find that in people. And so one of the ways I thought I've always kind of had this dream of like talking with somebody and hearing that pattern inside of them and that light inside of them and pulling out and putting in a song and giving them the song of their heart, right? Because it's in all of us, that song. And I think of the Psalms of David, and we all have Nephi's Psalm of Zion, that we all have that in us somewhere. And so I want to venture into that and kind of pull that out. I have one song I'm working on with a friend who we're kind of pulling some stories out and hopefully patterning it into a song that will be meaningful to a lot of people, and especially to the people we write it for. So hoping to venture into that. And what's interesting about that is I've desired to do that. I've never really like vocalized that too much to many people. Yet just in the last few weeks, I have had people from out of the woodworks that have no idea how they would even know, just message me words. It's just, I've had family members, I've had church members, ward members, friends, random people I don't know, just a list piling up of people saying, hey, these words came to me in sacrament today, and I just would really wonder if you want to put a song to it. And so it's like, obviously the Lord was doing something, I guess, because I told maybe like 2 people that that's a desire. And so now it's been kind of fun to see people's words and things, and that people actually have a desire for that. So hopefully we'll get into that, as fast as I can work. I'm a mom and have a new baby who's 4 months old, so he keeps me busy. So we'll do what we can. The other thing that I'll also kind of bring into this is a little bit of the quantum sciences. I love the quantum sciences. I actually failed high school chemistry, and then I became a chemist. And isn't that the way that the Lord works? Whatever you don't want to do, He will make sure you do. So be careful what you don't wish for. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about that on this channel, and then how the patterns and sequences tie into that, and how it all ties into the temple. When I have a huge passion for the temple. I think I always have, unknowingly. I'm a dreamer, so ever since I was little, I would have dreams about the temple, even before going or really knowing anything about it. In fact, I really didn't know anything about it until 2020. So until COVID hit and you couldn't go to the temple anymore, and then it was like, oh, now it all makes sense. Because what happened is I felt like what I learned there was now happening real life. And then I started to question, wait, was I not paying attention? I just thought that you went to the temple to do the work for the dead, and which you do, but I didn't. I've heard of it as it's a house of learning, but I never really applied that or understood or took to it. I didn't understand symbolism. I didn't understand anything that was going on, really. I mean, I was just trying to stay awake. So when things started to unfold in my life, that I was like, wait a minute, I think this happened. I think that this relates to what I learned there. Then I became a lot more interested. And that's exactly what I want to go into here. Is one of the most powerful things I've learned was President Nelson recently, in recent conferences, asked us to study about miracles, and he specified to study the doctrine of Christ. And I always thought the doctrine of Christ was just all the scriptures, and which they are, but I just looked at it so general and so broad. But as I went in and studied it, I found in 2 Nephi 32, I think it's verse 6 and 7, and Nephi said, it was these words he said that just rung in my head. He said, this is the doctrine of Christ. And then he says a lot, but it was those words, this is the doctrine of Christ. And I thought, wait a minute, he's specifying something. And he just spent all this time trying to tell us something, And then he's telling his brothers, I can't be any more playing with you. And I'm like, what am I missing? And so essentially what I've come to realize is that the doctrine of Christ is the covenant path, which seems so simple, obviously, but it is the way back. We go out of God's presence and we come back in. And so it is that way back. And as I study the temple more, I realize it is the patterns in the temple. It is the temple. And so when I looked at it that way, I no longer was looking at the stories as just general stories, but I realized that all these stories fit into the doctrine of Christ, into the covenant path, into the way back, into the pattern. And that pattern is found and held in the temple. And so by studying the temple, we become enlightened. So greater light and knowledge. And what's interesting to me is, going back to a little bit of the quantum science, is science actually made no sense to me until I started to look at it through a spiritual lens. And then it kind of all came together and started to make sense to me. And specifically in relation to the temple, one thing I find interesting was just a couple of weeks ago, a friend of mine sent me a History Channel episode on Isaac Newton. And of course, the History Channel makes it all dark and scary because the world likes to make anything religious dark and scary. But Isaac Newton supposedly had a deep passion for the temple, and that's kind of how he discovered Newtonian physics, was his studying of the temple. And specific to women, again, I've noticed over the last couple years that I can have a conversation with a woman who has no education, or somebody who's a stay-at-home mom, or doesn't work, or works in a different sector, or just, it doesn't matter what they do. I can have a conversation with so many women now about quantum physics, which always seemed like this strange, weird concept. And it's like they speak that language because they study the temple. It just makes sense to them. And so that's another thing I find really fascinating about what's going on with women right now, is this huge enlightening. There's no barrier between us and the ability to comprehend God and his ways. That is what the priesthood teaches us. And so God picked a 14-year-old plowboy for a reason, to show us that you don't have to have a secular education. You don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to have the experience in these things. You have to come closer to God, and he will teach you these things. And so I think as more people are really waking up to that awakening, that it just is becoming a natural form of conversation that just makes sense to them. Einstein did not develop all these mathematical equations to figure out what he did. He meditated and saw how light and matter and energy move together. And then he was not great at math. And so, as far as I can remember, right, he married a woman who was a mathematician, or came across a woman who was a mathematician. I think it ended up being his wife. And she taught him how mathematically to explain what he saw. And so we'll talk about that. We'll get into potential. I love quantum sciences because I love learning about the potential that God has for us. And so we'll talk a little bit about potential, and what that means in a spiritual sense, and us becoming like our Father in heaven. So we'll see that, how it applies to patterns and sequences, how it applies to God's laws, and specifically to his temple. And just like apparently Isaac Newton, that love for the temple is what unfolded all that. And so often the world is using that against religion and God to try to prove that he does not exist, when in fact it very plainly proves that he does. So we'll get into a lot of that as well too. I've learned that God is so simple, and it's us that's complicated, and we have to come up with all these things to prove or disprove that there's an existence or there isn't. And it's like Nephi when he says, I can't be any more plain. And Joseph Smith said that the book of Revelations is the most plain book ever written. And you read it and you're like, what? This is the most this is the most complicated book ever written. So is it God or is it us? I kind of feel like we're always doing it backwards. We're taking this complex puzzle and trying to rearrange it all and put it all together, right? That's as much as we can do. And rather than taking who he is and starting from the beginning and working out that way and letting everything else flow into that. So that'll be a huge topic of this channel, is how to take the pattern of God and who God is and what he is. I mean, right from the very beginning, he tells us, I am the beginning and the end, and in the beginning was the word. So why don't we start there and work outward rather than, well, this is what we have, this is all our data, and put it all in and try to explain it. And in the end, we end up confusing ourselves. Another reason I am doing this channel is to help fulfill my role as a woman in the gathering of Israel. President Nelson has said quite a bit about that. I don't think it's coincidental that he is our prophet at this time, that some of his biggest focuses throughout his whole time as a general authority leading up to him as the prophet were focused on women and the gathering of Israel. He's always had a passion for those two things, and I do think that they are very linked and connected in a way that we'll get into a little bit more here. But these are some things that he said. This is a quote from him. You remember that last June, Sister Nelson and I spoke to the youth of the church. We invited them to enlist in the Lord's Youth Battalion to help gather Israel on both sides of the veil. This gathering is the greatest challenge, the greatest cause, and the greatest work on earth today. It is a cause that desperately needs women, because women shape the future. So tonight I'm extending a prophetic plea to you, the women of the church, to shape the future by helping to gather scattered Israel. And then he has another quote here, sisters participating in the gathering of Israel. He speaks on, my dear sisters, you have special spiritual gifts and propensities. Tonight, I urge you with all the hope of my heart to pray to understand your spiritual gifts, to cultivate, use, and expand them even more than you ever have. You will change the world as you do so. And so for me, I've been trying to learn a lot about what are my specific spiritual gifts as a woman. And there's obviously, I don't know if it's obvious to everybody else, but to me, it's pretty obvious that there is a serious work going on with women in the church right now. There's an higher endowment. It feels like there were some changes in the temple endowment in 2019, and I think a lot of women have really woke up to understand what that means for them. It's just something I feel like is a part of maybe my own spiritual gifts, is that deep desire and love for the temple. So you can see that I have drawn here. This is just something I drew. Some other friends started it. I saw it, kind of grasped it, and just being enveloped in the temple that way and putting my scripture study into that has kind of changed everything, changed the perspective. And I've shared it with a few friends, and they've all said the same thing. Like when I think about the scriptures in connection with the temple, it enlightens the scriptures. And so that's going to be a big theme. We're going to get hopefully a PDF version of this that will be downloadable and printable on a website where you can use it to study, just take notes, and just whatever comes to your mind in relation to the temple as you are studying the scriptures. So we want to have that available for people to use as well as a resource to hopefully enlighten their minds a little bit more. And then in time, hopefully my husband will be able to he's going to put together a 3D model for me that will be available on a website too, that we can just, anybody can just go on and kind of look at with maybe a little bit more insights than what is not currently available in some of the other things that are out there. It just applying this concept of the scriptures fitting into this pattern. Okay, so just a quick explanation on what are patterns and sequences and why I chose that. I'm just going to share a little story, and it kind of has to do with a temple-like experience where I learned. This is actually where I feel like I was praying to know from the Lord, like, how is this done? How can you be so vast in everyone's life um, and still be so finite in my own? I believe that, but um, you know how essentially, and we don't always get answers to our questions, or sometimes we do, and we just don't recognize them, which we'll go into that. But I had I had been praying about that, and I'd also been praying to learn how to make my home more of a temple. It's another thing that um, the brethren have really focused on lately, as the storms in the world arise, that we need to make our home a temple and a sanctuary for our families to protect them. And so I've been praying to know how to do that. And one thing that came to my mind was, well, focus on Christ. And so the thought that came was, well, I'll make Christ the center of every room in my home. And I'm still working on it. But in my hallway, I have a large picture of him. In the front room, it's a temple. And just placing, what feels right for that room up in my little loft area where we kind of hang out as a family. Where in between us and the kids' bedrooms, I wanted a picture of Christ with children. So just ways to kind of like they do in the temple. And so I had been focusing on that. And at the time, my husband was working on building a fireplace in our house. Not this one, another one, but he was putting brick on like this one. And we were getting ready to paint the mantle. And we were debating, should we paint it white or should we paint it like a dark brown color? And I like both. And we kind of went back and forth. We have both in our house. We have dark brown wood and we also have white things. And so trying to decide, well, what are we going to be happier with? Would it look better with a white or would it look better with a brown? And I remember walking down my stairs looking at it and thinking, when I walk down these stairs, I don't want to regret what I do. I want to make sure that I get the one that I'm going to like and not regret. And it's too much work. So as I walked down the stairs, came to the bottom of the stairs, I just heard this voice say, "You can ask me." And I thought, well, that's a very worldly thing. It's not something I normally pray or ask about. The prophet had been teaching us to learn to hear him. And I had been putting a lot of effort into doing that. And I recognized this voice. And so I said, okay, it's kind of uncomfortable to pray about such a worldly thing, but okay, I will ask you. So I prayed and said, you would know which one I will be happier with. Would I be happier in the end with a white mantle or with a brown mantle? And so that was my prayer. Well, that night, I just happened to open, I wish I had the book, I returned it. I just happened to open, there was a book I was reading called The Beloved Bridegroom that a friend had lent me. And on the page that I was on, I just happened to notice that my friend had circled and starred this part where it talked about the symbolism of a white mantle. Of course, it's spelled different, the mantle being the mantle placed on you in the role which you hold. But she starred the words white mantle. And I thought, no way. And I thought, okay. And I kept reading on the next page. It talked about it again. She had circled and starred it again. And I thought, oh my goodness. And so the white mantle was a symbol of charity, of the pure love of God. And why this mattered to me was because, one, I was trying to make my home a temple. And this fireplace is, maybe I can get a picture up here. This fireplace is the center of my home. And I'm trying to make Christ the center of every room and the center of my home in doing so. And this fireplace is the real center, the feature of the home. And charity is the pure love of God. That is his eternal realm. It's It's who he is. It's what makes him who he is. So to place a white mantle in the center of my home that symbolized the pure love of God, the celestial realm of God, was like the cherry on top to the work I have been doing to try to make my home a temple. At that point, I realized, of course, I want a white mantle in my. I never want anything but a white mantle in my home ever from this point forward because of what it means and what it symbolizes. And so we painted our mantle white, and it's beautiful. And there's then we put the Christ on a statue of Christ on top. But the other thing that I learned from that experience was his ways. That was another thing I've been praying about. So he really like multidimensionally answered more than one question. He answered, my desire to make my home a temple. And he also answered the question about how is it done? How do you do it so vastly? And obviously I still don't know the answer to that, but I did get a little bit of insight seeing that this friend of mine had that book when she read it, months or years earlier, sitting there reading it, and her feeling prompted to circle and star that event, knowing, and the Lord knowing it was going to end up in my hands. He is so vast. So I started to see how he uses others as vessels, whether they know it or not, and his perfect timing. And they couldn't have been more perfect that happened to be the page I opened to. And at this time, President Nelson is saying, hey, study miracles and see them in your lives. And I'm starting to see how he works and how he does these. But it doesn't end there. Maybe like a week or so later, I ended up going to a friend's home to take them something. And while I was there, her husband has this row of books. And he took me in there and he said, hey, I heard you like books. So I'm like, yeah, I do. Gospel books specifically. And that's what he had, a whole row of gospel books. And he said, I didn't tell him any of this story. He just starts telling me, he said, this book is my favorite. And he pulls out this book from Neal A. Maxwell. And in that book, he said, he's always had a passion for reading books, especially Neal A. Maxwell is one of his favorites. And so anytime he goes into a used bookstore, he goes and he looks for something specifically like that, some good finds. And he said, he had just got called to a position in the church that he was feeling unqualified for or nervous to do, or like, why me, Heavenly Father, like, I can't do this. I'm a weak man, the Moses story. And while he was like praying for help to give him the strength to fulfill the calling, he went into this used bookstore and he pulled out a book by Maxwell, and he was so excited to find this book. And right in the beginning, it had his name. It was written by Neal A. Maxwell. It had his name that said, you've got this, Neal Maxwell, like, specifically to this friend. It wrote his name, you've got this, whether that was meant for somebody else or whether he knew somebody's going to need this book in the future, who knows. But he found his answer right when he turned to a book. So this is where the patterns and sequences come in. This was a pattern that had just happened in my life. And now I'm hearing again in another sequence in somebody else's life. That they themselves, I'm sitting here thinking, God just spoke to me through this book. He just answered me. How coincidental is that? And now that confirming voice from a friend you can't make that up, of having the same experience, and I didn't even tell him about mine, and so I just heard again the Lord speaking through his experience to me, confirming the experience that he just gave me. And then one thing I've learned about revelation and truth is that if it is true revelation, it will keep giving. It's never ending. It's eternal. And so it builds upon itself, and that's kind of the process of faith. And we'll do a whole thing about that. But um, now this is like a year and a half later. I'm at Cornbelly's with a friend, and he's talking to me about an experience he had as he's trying to learn, how heaven communicates with him. And I felt I should share this story with him about the mantle and the fireplace mantle. And so I shared with that and told him about the friend had circled this thing, and it caught my attention because it was a white mantle. It was exactly what I was praying about. So I shared that story with him, just the hopes that, it would help him in his trying to discover, how heaven speaks to him. And, well, rewind a little bit. Earlier that day, I was working on a new song about the spirit of revelation and Moses. And I was trying to get the words, I was praying, I want to make sure I get the words right to portray your pattern and your words properly. So there's this line that I had come up with earlier that day to put in the song, and it was to learn his mind, to feel his heart, and know him when he calls. And I, was praying, okay, I want to make sure these are the right words that I'm putting out here that would be true to your pattern. So then when I went with this friend, told him that story, told him about how the friend had circled and starred. Well, that night when I got home, as soon as I got home, another friend sent me a text message with a screenshot from his mission journal. And he circled and underlined these 3 words. First, we learn principles, then we feel principles, then we know principles. And those were the exact sequence of words that I have been praying to know if I should put in this song. To learn his mind, to feel his heart, and know him when he calls. To learn, to feel, to know. And a lot of that understanding I was trying to put out there comes from Doctrine and Covenants, chapter 8, where the Lord tells Oliver Cowdery, I will put it in your mind and your heart, and your mind and your heart. And this is the spirit of revelation. And this is the spirit by which Moses parted the Red Sea. So this is what my song's about. So it's very important to me that I am portraying the correct symbols or words in this music that I'm putting out. And so he underlined, learn, feel, know. I mean, again, another sequential pattern. If I had not just told my friend this story about circling, I wouldn't have noticed that about the one friend that circled in the book, I would not have noticed or paid attention when the next friend sent me a text and circled. I probably wouldn't have been aware. I would have just been like, oh, okay. But because I just had a conversation about circling an answer, and it caught my attention. Like, wait a minute. We're just talking about, so why are you circling this? And as I look closer, the exact words to the lyrics that I wrote were revealed in his thing. So at that point, then I know, right? First I learned, like, I think these are the words. I did the studying. I mean, it totally embodies what I'm trying to portray in the song. I first did the studying that I needed to do to come up with that in the first place. So that's the learn part. And then when all this process came together, I felt it as soon as I realized the two had come together, right? And so I felt, oh my gosh, these are just the words I was praying to know about. And then at that point, I knew, yes, these are the right words. So, and that's kind of the whole process of what I was trying to portray. And so I'll do a whole more in-depth video about that, about Moses, about his story, the spirit of revelation specifically, in another video. But I just wanted to portray an idea of like, what are patterns and sequences and why are they important to me? What do they have to do with the temple? So that's a little bit about me and why I'm doing this. We'll a little bit of things that we'll get into in future videos. We will first We'll use science to bust the myth that God actually does exist. We'll just go straight there, because if we can go into who and what God is, then everything else comes out of that rather than going backwards. So we'll start off with that one. That'll be the next video. We'll also get into the spirit of revelation a little bit, and just some symbolism of that journey and what that looks like. For sure going to dive into the temple diagram, the Moses' tabernacle, and kind of tie some fun pieces in together in the scriptures there in coming videos. And then we'll go over some of the recent talks by President Nelson that had a lot to do with the temple and kind of just discuss those a little bit. We can also venture a little bit into the Come Follow Me lessons. We're studying about Christ and the New Testament this coming year. But we'll just kind of see where the wind takes us. There's a lot of stories that apply in this pattern. So we'll kind of just, the whole purpose of what we'll be trying to do on this channel is to help enlighten your own personal study through scripture, through modern day prophet and revelation talks, conferences, and hopefully feel more edified by doing so. So to sum up, the point of this channel would be to learn how to apply the holy patterns of God and his covenant path, that we can become the temple of God and that he can dwell more in us. And by going to the temple to be with God, we then leave with him more empowered inside of us and him dwelling more in us, and that relationship that's created there. So in Corinthians it says, know ye not that ye are the temple of God and that my spirit dwelleth in you. So that will be a big theme of our discussions here.